I still remember the sound of the glass door closing behind me as I stepped into that place. It could have been a bank, a store, a room full of people dressed neatly in pressed suits and shiny shoes. I had come as I always do, modestly, in the clothes I could afford, the clothes that had carried me through a lifetime of work. My shoes were worn at the edges, my jacket a little faded at the cuffs, but they were clean, pressed as best as I could manage, and they represented my dignity. Yet the moment I walked through that door, heads turned. Eyes flicked from my face to my clothes, and then came the sound that cuts sharper than a knife. The muffled laugh. It started with two young clerks whispering near the counter. "Look at her," one said, thinking I couldn't hear. "So outdated. Who even wears that anymore?" Another voice chimed in with a smirk I could see even without hearing the words. Their stares crawled over me like judgment, stripping me of the humanity I had carried in with me. I was not a customer anymore, not a person with a story, not a woman who had survived more storms than they could imagine. To them, in that moment, I was just my old clothes. I tightened my grip on the strap of my bag, willing myself to ignore it, to stand tall. But the whispers spread like smoke, invisible yet choking. A woman in line behind me leaned to her companion, her lips curling as she nodded in my direction. Even a child tugged at his mother's hand, pointing with innocent curiosity at the old-fashioned lady. I wanted to scream at them all, "Do you see these clothes, or do you see the life behind them?" But my throat tightened, words trapped where my pride was trying to hold them in. The clerk at the counter looked up, his smile thin and professional until his eyes landed on me. It faltered, just enough for me to see what he was thinking but would never say out loud. He straightened his tie, his eyes darting over my faded jacket, the shoes that had walked too many miles. And then, with a tone coated in condescension, he asked, "Do you need help, ma'am?" The way he said "ma'am" was not respect. It was dismissal dressed as politeness. I felt the sting of humiliation, sharp and hot, crawling into the spaces of my chest that I had fought for years to keep filled with dignity. My pulse thudded in my ears, my hand shook just enough for the pen to tremble when I signed my name. The air conditioning blasted cold across the room, but my skin burned. In that instant, I understood what it meant to be judged by nothing more than what was draped across your shoulders. They saw my clothes, not my story. That sentence rang inside my mind like a bell, because if they had looked deeper, they would have seen the decades of sacrifice stitched into every seam. They would have seen the markets where I worked until dawn, the nights when I skipped meals so others could eat, the mornings when I stood tall even when grief bent me low. These old clothes were not shame. They were testimony. Yet no one in that room cared to look. If you've ever been judged unfairly by your clothes, your age, your appearance, your silence, I ask you to like this video and subscribe. It may seem small, but every click makes stories like mine visible, makes voices like mine harder to ignore. Because the truth is, one act of recognition can be the difference between being erased and being remembered. So let me leave you with a question. Have you ever been underestimated, mocked, or dismissed, only to prove later that you were more than they ever imagined? Share your story in the comments. You never know who might read your words and find the strength to rise again. Before the mocking stares, before the whispers that cut deeper than knives, my life was a series of bricks stacked carefully, each one held together with sweat and sacrifice. People saw only the faded seams of my jacket, the worn leather of my shoes. But what they did not see was the journey behind them. Every crease, every stitch had been earned. My clothes did not speak of failure. They spoke of survival, of love, of resilience. And yet, in that moment of judgment, no one cared to know the story. When I was younger, mornings began before the sun itself dared to rise. I would brew a cup of coffee, its bitter aroma filling the small kitchen, and open my ledger, pen in hand. The ink stained my fingertips as I recorded every cent I had made, every cent I had saved. My late husband used to tease me, saying I trusted numbers more than people. He wasn't wrong. Numbers, at least, never lied. They told me how far we had come, how much we had built from nothing. They told me that the nights I spent on my feet, working stalls at the market, bending under the weight of sacks filled with produce, had been worth it. Every peso I saved carried a story. There was the coin I tucked away instead of buying bread so my son could have shoes for school. There was the folded bill I placed in the jar after, working 2 shifts back to back. There was the crumpled note I earned scrubbing floors while my body ached, whispering to myself that one day the struggle would ease. Brick by brick, I built a life not out of luxury, but out of persistence. The house we lived in, the table we gathered around, the very clothes on our backs, they were all born of these sacrifices. The bank was part of that story too. It wasn't just a place to deposit money. It was where I opened my first account, hands trembling as I signed the forms, never imagining the sums would one day grow. I remember the manager back then, a kind man with glasses, who shook my hand and told me, "You're starting something strong." He knew my name, knew my birthday, even sent me a card once. The bank became more than numbers. It became a symbol of stability, an old friend I thought would remember my face even as time wore new lines into it. But life has a way of shifting. My husband passed, leaving me with children to raise alone. The world did not pause for my grief. Markets changed, bills climbed, and I carried it all on my shoulders. Yet still, I saved. Still, I wrote in that ledger, ink blotting pages late into the night, while the coffee grew cold beside me. And as the years went by, I built not just security, but trust. In the institutions I believed were there to protect me. In the family I believed would always honor me. When my children grew older, they began to help with my finances. At first I welcomed it. They spoke of simplifying things, of making life easier for me. They said signatures were just formalities, that all I had to do was trust them, and I wanted to believe them, because I had given them everything. I never thought to question whether their idea of help might also mean taking pieces of what I had bled to build. Looking back now, I see how the threads of betrayal had already been woven quietly into the fabric of my life. But at the time, I didn't notice. I only saw the clothes I wore as markers of endurance, not realizing others would one day see them as targets for mockery. Because here's the truth. My clothes may have been old, but they were honest. They carried the scent of markets at dawn, the trace of sweat from nights too long, the memory of hands blistered from work that few would dare to do. They were not rags, they were relics of resilience. Every fiber told the story of a woman who had given everything she had and asked for nothing in return except respect. So when I walked into that place and heard laughter, it wasn't just about fabric. It was about erasing decades of sacrifice with one cruel glance. It was about ignoring the story that had been stitched into every seam. And if you think old clothes mean a person is worth less, then you have never known what it means to fight for every inch of dignity. Now I ask you, if you poured your life into building something, if you stitched every piece of your story into the fabric of your days, how would you feel to be mocked for it? Tell me in the comments, because your story might be the reminder someone else needs to never bow their head in shame again. The moment I stepped up to the counter, everything inside that place turned into a stage, and I was forced into the role of spectacle. The clerk didn't just look at me, he measured me, scanning my clothes, my posture, the way my hands trembled slightly as I held out my papers. His smile was thin, the kind that hides disdain behind a mask of professionalism. He glanced at the documents I placed before him, and I could almost see the thought written across his face. These don't belong to someone like her. He tapped at the keyboard, screen flashing colors I couldn't see, only the sharp beep that followed each entry. His brows furrowed. Then he leaned slightly to whisper to the manager hovering nearby. The whisper was not meant for me, but humiliation has a way of amplifying every sound. I caught fragments. Signature doesn't match. Flagged. Restricted. The manager took the papers from his hand, stamped them with a harsh red mark that might as well have been carved into my skin. Restricted. In that instant, I was no longer a client. I was a problem to be removed. The manager approached, his tone soaked with condescension. "Ma'am, I think you're confused. The signature on file isn't yours." The words burned. Confused. I had built a life from numbers and ink, kept ledgers that tracked every sacrifice, every gain. And yet here he was, dismissing decades of my existence with one sentence. My hand shook as I reached into my bag, pulling out my old passbook, worn at the edges, but filled with entries written by tellers who once knew my name. I showed photographs, deposit slips with my signature, receipts yellowed with age. I laid them out like evidence in a trial, but instead of recognition, I was met with laughter muffled behind polite smiles. "Stories," one of them muttered under his breath, as if my proof was nothing, more than fables spun by an old woman clinging to pride. The line of customers behind me began to stir. Eyes fixed on me, whispers moving like ripples across water. A child pointed, not with malice, but with the innocent curiosity that slices just as deep. "Why is that lady being scolded?" he asked aloud, and his mother hushed him, but not before everyone heard. My cheeks burned hotter than fire. The guard at the door shifted, his hand resting closer to his belt as though I were a threat for daring to stand there. I pressed my documents forward again, desperation clawing at my throat. "These are mine. This account is mine. I opened it when I was younger than you," I said, pointing at the teller who had stamped me away. But my words bounced off walls of apathy. The manager leaned closer, his voice lower now, so the crowd could still hear but not mistake the disdain. "Please, step aside. You're blocking real clients." Those words lodged themselves like thorns. Real clients. As if my decades of deposits, my loyalty, my trust, meant nothing. As if I was invisible, a ghost haunting a place that once knew my name. The murmurs in the line grew louder, some shaking their heads with pity, others with annoyance that I was wasting their time. I felt smaller than I had in years, pressed down by the weight of all those eyes. I thought of the nights I had spent saving each coin, of the times I went without so my children could have more, of the trust I had poured into this place that now looked at me as if I were nothing. My clothes may have been old, but my money was not counterfeit. My sacrifices were not illusions. Yet none of that mattered in that lobby filled with polished shoes and sharp suits. They reduced me to a woman too poor, too old, too outdated to be worthy of respect. And still, I stood. My hands may have trembled, but I refused to let them see me crumble. Even in humiliation, there is a line one does not cross, the line of surrender. I swallowed my pride, gathered my papers with shaking fingers and stepped aside. Not because they were right, but because I knew this was not the end. Now I ask you, have you ever been treated like you don't count, as if your presence was an inconvenience, as if your years of sacrifice were invisible? Tell me in the comments and type, "I see you," because sometimes the only way to fight invisibility is to remind the world we are still here. When humiliation pushes you out the door, sometimes fate arranges one last test before you disappear. That day, with my papers crumpled in my trembling hands, I walked past the glass entrance, my head low but my chest still heavy with unshed words. The heat of shame still burned my cheeks, but outside the air was different, sharper, and it carried voices I was not supposed to hear. 2 employees, careless in their arrogance, stood by the side of the building, smoking and laughing softly. I froze when their words cut through the air. "Did you see her? Poor thing. Doesn't even realize the transfer went through. Her son filed the authority last week. I felt the blood drain from my face. My son. Authority. Transfer. The words twisted into chains around my heart. They weren't speaking about confusion at all. They were speaking about theft, about betrayal carried out behind my back, stamped and signed by hands that should have protected me. Their laughter was cruel, but it was also confirmation. This wasn't a mistake. This was a plan. I moved away quickly, afraid. They would see me, but their words stayed lodged in my ears. That night, I spread my documents across the table under the dim light of my old lamp. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second louder than the last, each one demanding answers. My fingers traced the faded ink of receipts, deposit slips, and contracts, memories flooding me with each touch. These weren't just papers. They were proof of my life. They were the sacrifices of my youth, the evidence of every coin earned with blistered hands. Tears came, hot and unwanted, falling onto the papers until the ink blurred. But then something shifted. The pain transformed into clarity. Betrayal had pushed me low, but it also lit a fire inside me. For every slip they tried to erase, I had another they didn't know existed. In the back of my drawer, I remembered, there were titles, land shares, deeds, things too valuable to risk leaving in one place. And there was that one untouched emergency account, created years ago in secrecy, when I promised myself I would always keep a corner of my strength hidden, just in case. I pulled those documents out like weapons. The deed shimmered under the light, the embossed seal still intact, undeniable. The account statement, though untouched for years, bore my name clearly, boldly. A surge of power coursed through me as I realized. They thought they had erased me, but they had only taken what I had let them see. My true strength was still mine. The betrayal of my own blood hurt more than the sneers of strangers. My son's signature, placed where mine should have been, burned into my mind. But instead of crushing me, it sharpened me. I whispered into the silence, "You will not take everything. You will not take me." I organized the documents into neat stacks, each one representing a piece of my story they had overlooked. I saw, for the first time in years, not the woman mocked for her clothes, but the woman who had built, saved, protected, and endured. They could laugh at the jacket on my shoulders, but they could not laugh away the evidence of who I truly was. And as dawn approached, I knew I had reached a breaking point. I was done waiting for respect to be handed to me. If the world wanted to treat me as invisible, I would remind it of the truth in a language no one could ignore. Proof, signed and sealed. So I ask you, if someone tried to erase your name, if they thought they could take your life's work without consequence, would you bow your head, or would you rise with every hidden strength you've kept for a day like this? Tell me in the comments, because your answer might be the fire someone else needs to find their voice again. The next morning, I walked into my old neighborhood, the streets lined with memories only I seemed to remember. Each storefront carried echoes of another time, when my husband and I worked side by side, when our children laughed in the back of the shop, when every coin we earned felt like a seed planted in the soil of tomorrow. That day, I wasn't going back as a woman humiliated at a counter. I was returning as a woman on a mission. I pushed open the door of my former company's small office, now run by a colleague, who had stayed loyal through the years. The smell of paper, ink, and coffee greeted me like an old friend. And when he looked up and saw me, recognition lit his eyes. Not pity, not mockery, recognition. "It's been too long," he said, his voice full of warmth. In that instant, I knew I had found an ally. I laid my documents before him, not as a victim begging for validation, but as a builder showing the blueprint of a life. He took them in his hands, his eyes scanning the details with a seriousness the bank had denied me. "These are solid," he murmured, "more solid than they realize." My heart steadied. For the first time since the humiliation, someone saw me not as confusion, not as trouble, but as competence. Together we pieced through every record, every receipt, every line of ink that told my story. He produced copies of original signature cards stored in the archives, my signature bold, unmistakable. A mirror of the one they claimed was not mine. He drafted a notarized revocation of the power of attorney my son had filed, ensuring that his authority over my finances would no longer stand unchallenged. He advised me to gather not only proof of identity, but also proof of power. And so I did. From the folder I had guarded for years, I revealed the account statement untouched since its creation, a lifeline I had hidden from everyone. His eyes widened slightly as he read the figures. "They won't see this coming," he said, a half smile tugging at his lips. I felt the fire inside me glow brighter, but the greatest revelation was yet to come. In another folder lay the deed to the very building where the branch now stood. Years ago, when my company had grown, we had purchased property, a quiet investment for stability. That building had been leased to the bank itself. And here, in black and white, was the undeniable truth. They weren't just dismissing a client. They were humiliating their landlord. The power of that knowledge surged through me like a tide. I wasn't simply a woman in old clothes. I was a woman whose name was written into the foundation of the ground they stood on. They had mocked me, erased me, tried to shove me aside, but they had forgotten something essential. You cannot erase the hands that built the very floor beneath your feet. My colleague leaned back in his chair, astonishment on his face. "Do you realize what this means?" he asked. I nodded, calm now, a steady resolve replacing the trembling of humiliation. "Yes," I said. "It means they're going to remember who I am." He helped me organize everything into a timeline. The deeds, the signature cards, the notarized documents, the receipts, the proof of ownership, even the whisper I had overheard outside the branch. Piece by piece, my story, transformed from memory into weapon. I retrieved the contact of the regional director, a man who had once partnered with my company for payroll. If the branch refused to recognize me, the higher office would have no choice. As I walked home with the folder pressed against my chest, I felt taller than I had in years. The streets that once seemed heavy with sorrow now seemed lighter, each step echoing with purpose. My clothes were still the same, worn and plain, but in my hands I carried an armor no one could deny. So I ask you now, what strength have you hidden away, waiting for the day you would need it? What proof of your worth lies in drawers, in memories, in quiet corners of your life that the world has ignored? Tell me in the comments, because sometimes the greatest power comes not from what others give us, but from what we remember we already have. The day of the meeting arrived like a storm I had been waiting for all my life. I walked into the branch not as a customer, not as a woman to be mocked, but as a force. My clothes were the same, plain, worn, honest, but this time I carried something stronger than fabric. Proof, history, power. At the table sat the regional director, crisp suit, polished shoes, and beside him the very manager who had once called me confused. His eyes flickered with a mix of discomfort and defiance, but I didn't flinch. I took my seat and laid the thick folder down with the weight of decades. The director began politely, asking for my version of the events. My voice was steady, controlled. I told him everything, the whispers, the red stamp of restricted, the humiliation of being told to step aside because I wasn't a real client. And then, without raising my voice, I opened the folder. Out came the notarized documents, the original signature cards, the revocation of authority that stripped my son's betrayal of its power. I slid them across the table one by one, like a deck of undeniable truth. The manager's face tightened, his jaw flexing as if each page struck him harder than the last. Still, I wasn't finished. I produced the statement from the untouched emergency account, my name blazing across the top. I presented the receipts, the passbook, the photographs, each one a relic of loyalty turned into evidence. And then came the final strike, the deed. The paper that proved I was not just a client, but the owner of the very building they occupied. The silence in the room grew heavy. The director leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he read the seal, the signatures, the dates. When he looked up, his tone had shifted. "Mrs. Atz," he said, "your company processed payroll through this bank for over 15 years. I remember." Recognition, respect. Finally. The manager shifted uncomfortably, his earlier arrogance melting into a sheen of nervous sweat. He tried to protest, to mumble something about protocol, about mistaken files, but the director silenced him with a single look. My story was no longer a burden to be brushed aside. It was a force that demanded reckoning. I stated my demands clearly, not as pleas, but as conditions. Reverse the unauthorized transfers, freeze all access that was not mine, audit the branch to uncover every hand that had dared to erase me, and remove the staff who treated me with contempt. My voice did not waver, and in that stillness I saw the shift, the moment they realized I was not a woman to dismiss. I was the very foundation they stood on. The director nodded, slowly, his pen moving across the paper as he authorized the actions. "Your accounts will be restored immediately. An investigation will follow. And, Mrs. Ixie, you have our apologies." Apologies spoken in the same walls where I had once been told I was blocking real clients. That moment was not just justice, it was reversal. But my dignity demanded more. I looked the manager in the eyes, not with hatred, but with the full weight of my presence. "You wanted me to step aside. Now it is you who must." And indeed, in the days that followed, he was removed from his position. His smug whisper was silenced by the very truth he had tried to bury. I did not remain their client after that. Yes, my accounts were restored, my money returned, my name cleared, but trust was broken. I moved my primary banking to a competitor. Not in anger, but in power. It was my decision, my choice, my terms. I left them not as the woman mocked for her clothes, but as the woman whose story they had been forced to acknowledge. And so I ask you, what would you do if those who mocked you were suddenly forced to recognize your worth? Would you accept their apology and stay, or would you rise and walk away on your own terms? Tell me in the comments, because your answer might show someone else how to reclaim their dignity. The morning after the reversal, I sat at my own desk, the sun spilling through the window in golden light. For the first time in months, the weight on my chest had lifted. The desk was tidy, now folders stacked neatly, each labeled with care. The same papers that had once been scattered in desperation now sat in order, like soldiers prepared for any future battle. My coffee steamed gently, and when I lifted the cup, it wasn't with trembling hands, but with steadiness. This was more than a drink. It was a symbol that I was choosing the rhythm of my life again. I knew better than to fool myself into believing that forgiveness meant forgetting. Betrayal leaves marks that no apology can erase, but I also knew that carrying bitterness would only poison me further. So I set boundaries, not walls of anger, but steps of wisdom. From that day on, no document would be signed without dual authorization. Every paper would pass through the eyes of independent counsel. I would never again allow unsupervised signatures or silent transfers. Love could remain, but trust now had rules. That was my freedom with terms. As I sipped my coffee, my youngest grandchild toddled into the room, her eyes wide and curious. She tugged at my sleeve and asked in her innocent voice, "Grandma, were the people at the bank mean to you?" I looked down at her soft face, and I felt a tenderness rise inside me. I could have told her about the shame, the whispers, the sting of being laughed at. But instead, I smiled with quiet strength. "They forgot who I was," I told her, and I reminded them. No bitterness, no tears, just truth spoken with power. Later that day I gathered my children, not to scold, but to set things straight. I explained the new boundaries with clarity, making it impossible for anyone to mistake kindness for weakness again. Some protested, some remained silent, but I didn't falter. I wasn't asking for permission, I was declaring my terms. This was no longer about saving what had been taken. It was about protecting what remained, ensuring my story could never again be dismissed as confusion or erased with a stamp. I realized something important in those days. Protecting yourself is not selfishness. It is survival. It is dignity. It is teaching the next generation that love must never be confused with blind surrender. And so I spoke to my grandchildren not only of kindness and family, but of documents, of deeds, of the importance of knowing where everything is. One day, I told them, you must list your 3 most important documents: your ID, your deed or lease, your account access, and you must tell one trusted person where they are. Because protection begins with preparation. I watched their young faces absorb my words, perhaps not fully understanding, but hearing enough to carry with them into their own futures. That was my gift to them. Not just money or possessions, but wisdom forged through fire. As I sat back at my desk, the folders before me, I felt a new kind of peace. It wasn't naive peace, the kind that hopes no storm will come again. It was warrior's peace, the calm of someone who knows storms will come, but is no longer afraid. The world had tried to reduce me to nothing, to mock me for the clothes on my back, to erase the story in my hands. But I had answered with proof, with power, with boundaries. I was free, not because they gave me freedom, but because I had claimed it. And now I turn the question to you. What step can you take tonight to protect your story, your dignity, your future? Comment stronger if you are ready to take one action, even a small one, that ensures no one will ever erase who you are. Because strength is not about never falling. It is about rising with terms and never again allowing anyone to write your story for you. When I look back at everything I endured, from the whispers of strangers to the betrayal of those I trusted most, I realized that my story was never just about money or accounts. It was about identity. It was about proving that dignity cannot be erased with a stamp, a smirk, or a stolen signature. The world tried to shrink me down to the old jacket on my shoulders, but I discovered that the true measure of who I am has never been written in fabric. It has always been written in faith, resilience, and the choices I refused to surrender. There were moments when I thought silence was easier, when I believed swallowing the shame would protect me from the fire of confrontation. But silence is a slow death. It convinces you that invisibility is survival, when in truth it only feeds the very hands that try to erase you. It took humiliation to push me into rediscovering the strength I had hidden away, the strength I had parked in drawers and folders and memories. And once I found it, I knew I could never again allow anyone to speak for me, decide for me, or diminish me. Faith carried me when my heart was broken, when the weight of betrayal pressed me into the ground. I prayed not for vengeance, but for clarity. And in that prayer, I received more than answers. I received courage. Courage to gather my papers, to walk into that meeting, to look people in the eye who thought I would always bow my head. Courage to demand respect not as a favor, but as a right. And now, with the sun on my desk and the future in my hands, I understand something deeper. Survival is not enough. We are not called only to survive humiliation. We are called to transform it. We are called to rise from it stronger, to set boundaries that guard our dignity, to teach others that respect is not negotiable. Forgiveness may heal the heart, but wisdom builds the walls that keep it safe. I do not tell my story to boast. I tell it because I know there are others, perhaps you, who have been laughed at, dismissed, underestimated. I tell it because I want you to know that no matter how small they try to make you feel, your worth is never measured by their eyes. Your worth is written in every sacrifice, every step, every scar that brought you here. And if you are still standing, you are already victorious. So let this be your reminder. Gather your strength, gather your proof, gather your faith. Protect what you have built, no matter how modest it may seem. Speak your truth even when your voice shakes. And remember, the world may mock your clothes, your age, your silence, but it cannot mock the fire inside you unless you let it go out. If this story spoke to you, if it awakened something you had forgotten, I invite you to like this video and subscribe. Every voice that joins makes it harder for others to silence stories like ours. And do not stop here. In the next chapter, I will show you how I locked my finances and my dignity in a way that no betrayal, no institution, and no whisper could ever touch again. You won't want to miss it, because what comes next is not just about survival, it is about transformation.